Did anyone ask you a single thing? The voice of George Foster sliced through the cold, expansive Chicago boardroom like a sudden crack of a whip. He did not even bother to look at Rachel Davis when he spat those words out. George was leaning back in his luxurious leather chair, his fingers interlaced over the polished mahogany table, his sharp eyes fixed solely on the financial graphs projected onto the massive screen. A cruel, quiet smirk played at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that held absolutely zero warmth. Rachel had just placed the silver thermal coffee pot gently on the side table, fulfilling her daily invisible routine. She was only there to refill the porcelain cups, a morning ghost on the executive floor of Foster Capital. Enter, serve, vanish without making a sound. That was the unbreakable rule of her existence. But on this particular frigid morning, the invisible script had been shattered. As Rachel approached the center of the table to retrieve an empty cup, she overheard Oliver Brooks, the chief financial officer, making a declaration that made her blood run entirely cold. Oliver stated confidently that the numbers for the Montgomery Group were absolutely solid, and that they should proceed with the massive corporate acquisition without any reservations. Rachel froze in her tracks, not out of clumsiness, but because her mind instantly processed the catastrophic error in his statement. Her body simply locked up, gripped by a profound, undeniable certainty that originated from a depth of knowledge no one in that room could ever suspect she possessed. The assertion was fatally flawed, and in that fleeting half-second of hesitation, George Foster noticed her. "What is it?" George fired the question like a bullet, violently spinning his heavy chair to face the woman in the gray uniform. "Why did you just stop?" The entire room plunged into an icy, paralyzing stillness. Hannah Miller, the director of strategy, slowly lifted her gaze from her glowing tablet, looking at Rachel with the distinct disgust one might reserve for an insect crawling across a pristine dining table. Oliver Brooks stopped speaking entirely, leaving his triumphant sentence hanging awkwardly in the tense air. Caleb Moore, the youngest analyst at the far end of the gathering, gently lowered his expensive pen and remained perfectly motionless, acutely aware that any sudden movement might draw the predator's gaze. All 8 highly paid executives seated around the imposing table shifted their attention simultaneously, their judgmental eyes locking onto the fragile-looking woman in the cleaning apron, who stood clutching a thermal pot. "I apologize, sir," Rachel murmured softly, forcing her limbs to move as she took a tentative step backward. "I was just leaving the room." But George immediately raised his hand, a commanding gesture that brought her to an abrupt halt. His cruel smile widened significantly, and anyone who had worked for George Foster knew exactly what that specific expression meant. A brutal spectacle was about to unfold, and he had just found his helpless target for the morning's entertainment. "No, you do not get to leave just yet," George insisted, his voice dripping with condescension. "You stopped right when Oliver mentioned the financial numbers. I saw your face change. What exactly is the problem here? Did you not approve of our chief financial officer's extensive market analysis?" A stifled giggle echoed from the side of the room. It was Hannah, who politely covered her mouth with her manicured hand while exchanging a highly amused glance with Oliver. Oliver did not laugh out loud, but his relaxed posture indicated he was thoroughly enjoying the sudden diversion. Benjamin Vance, the director of institutional relations, simply adjusted his glasses and tilted his head, watching Rachel as if she were a fascinating, albeit pathetic, laboratory experiment. "Sir, I really do not have an opinion," Rachel tried to say, maintaining a steady but quiet tone, desperate to escape the suffocating attention. George instantly cut her off, leaning aggressively forward and resting his elbows heavily on the table, like a predator zeroing in on a wounded deer. "Come on, enlighten us. Tell us what your expert opinion is regarding the acquisition of the Montgomery Group. I genuinely want to hear it, and I am quite sure everyone else here wants to hear it too, right, folks?" He swept his gaze around the room, silently demanding complicity from his subordinates. Hannah nodded with a tight, malicious grin, while Oliver crossed his arms confidently, waiting for the humiliating show to commence. Penelope Ross, a junior analyst, stared intensely at her own folders, utterly terrified to look up and meet the cleaner's eyes. Caleb Moore clenched his jaw tight, clearly distressed by the senseless bullying, yet he remained completely silent, lacking the courage to intervene. "Go ahead," George urged mockingly, gesturing toward the projection screen with an open palm as if inviting a star performer to a grand stage. "Give us your deep analysis. Show us exactly how the cleaning lady perceives the complex global financial market. I promise you, I am all ears." The silence that followed was suffocating, resembling the dreadful quiet of a Roman arena just moments before the inevitable bloodshed. Rachel felt a burning heat rush up her neck and flush her cheeks. Her calloused fingers gripped the handle of the thermos so fiercely that her knuckles turned stark white and throbbed with pain. Her racing heart hammered violently against her ribs, every survival instinct screaming at her to lower her head, beg for forgiveness, and run out of those heavy double doors as fast as her legs could carry her. It was the safe route, the path she had taken every single day for months in this Chicago skyscraper, remaining unseen, swallowing her pride, and shrinking into the background. But the echoing laughter and George's unrelenting mockery awakened a dormant memory of her mother, Irene, who always told her that dignity meant never letting anyone make you feel small. Rachel took a deep breath and softly replied that the free cash flow of the Montgomery Group could not possibly sustain the projected models on the screen. The smug smile on George Foster's face faltered instantly, cracking just a fraction of an inch. It did not vanish entirely, for he was a man forged in ruthless corporate battles and knew how to hold a poker face. But a nearly imperceptible tremor at the corner of his lips betrayed his sudden confusion. "What did you just say?" he asked, his tone still laced with heavy mockery, yet now tainted with a thin thread of genuine disbelief. Rachel did not look at his intimidating eyes. Instead, she fixed her gaze squarely on the glowing projection screen, and when she opened her mouth again, her voice had completely transformed. Gone was the timid, apologetic whisper of the frightened cleaner. It was replaced by a voice vibrating with undeniable, absolute authority. "The operational margin has plummeted over the last 3 consecutive periods," Rachel stated clearly, her words echoing off the glass walls. "The short-term debt has grown dangerously above their actual cash generation capacity. Furthermore, the massive revenue projection you are relying on is entirely based on a public sector contract that has not yet been officially renewed. Given the historical delays associated with this specific type of public renewal, there is a very real mathematical probability that it will not materialize within the incredibly optimistic time frame your team is considering." The silence that swallowed the room was no longer the silence of an arrogant arena. It was the deafening, terrifying quiet of a massive earthquake. It was that absurd, frozen instant when the solid ground violently shifts beneath your feet, and everyone stands paralyzed, unable to comprehend the disaster unfolding around them. Hannah Miller abruptly pulled her hands away from her expensive tablet, as if the screen had suddenly caught fire. Oliver Brooks uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, his previously entertained expression melting into a mask of pure, undeniable dread. Benjamin Vance stopped adjusting his glasses, completely stunned. Penelope Ross finally lifted her head, staring at the woman in the apron with her mouth hanging wide open in shock. Caleb Moore accidentally let go of his silver pen, which rolled off the polished table and hit the carpeted floor with a soft thud that nobody noticed. George Foster remained frozen for several long, agonizing seconds that felt like an eternity. His sharp eyes were locked onto Rachel, visibly struggling to process a reality that fundamentally defied the rigid social hierarchy he had meticulously constructed. The gray uniform, the cheap cleaning supplies, the heavy thermos, none of it matched the sophisticated financial vocabulary pouring from her lips. "What kind of sick joke is this?" he finally demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble. "Who put you up to this? Which one of you comedians in this room thought it would be hilarious to rehearse corporate finance jargon with the coffee lady?" George whipped his head around, glaring at his highly paid executives, desperately searching for a guilty smirk, waiting for someone to confess to this elaborate prank. Nobody smiled, and absolutely nobody uttered a single word. Hannah stared at Rachel with wild eyes, oscillating between complete incredulity and a rising defensive fury. Oliver vigorously rubbed his sweating forehead with his trembling fingers, his eyes darting frantically across the charts on the screen, as if he were seeing the damning numbers for the very first time. "Nobody told me to do anything, sir," Rachel replied firmly, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered to avoid a direct confrontation that she knew would end poorly. "You specifically demanded my opinion, and I gave it." George abruptly pushed himself up, his heavy chair rolling backward violently. He slammed both his hands flat onto the mahogany table, leaning his intimidating frame toward her. "That is not an opinion. That is you parroting complicated terms you overheard in the hallways. You have absolutely no idea what free cash flow is, and you certainly do not understand operational margins." Rachel did not flinch, continuing as if his outburst was nothing more than background noise. "The cross-penalty clause in the Montgomery contract with the Serrano Bank dictates that if the public renewal fails, the bank can execute an early guarantee. If that happens post-acquisition, Foster Capital absorbs a catastrophic hidden liability that is completely absent from all your current projections." This time, the resulting silence was absolute and crystalline, born of pure, unadulterated shock. Hannah forcefully pushed her chair away from the table, desperately needing physical distance from the utter destruction of her strategy. Oliver let out a shaky sigh, attempting to mask his panic with a fake cough, but his terror was palpable to everyone present. Caleb stared at Rachel with a newfound, radiant admiration shining in his wide eyes. Breaking the deathly quiet, Penelope Ross turned to Oliver and whispered loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "She is absolutely right about the Serrano Bank clause. I noticed that specific penalty last week, and I honestly did not understand why nobody on the senior team had flagged it." Oliver shot a murderous, desperate glare at Penelope, who immediately shrank back and sealed her lips. But the catastrophic damage was already done. The devastating confirmation had come directly from a member of their own financial team, and George Foster had absorbed every single syllable. Slowly, deliberately, the powerful chief executive officer turned his attention back to Rachel. The arrogant smile was completely eradicated from his face, replaced by a severe, dark expression that his executives rarely witnessed. "Who in the world are you?" George asked, his voice entirely stripped of its previous mockery, leaving behind only a raw, dangerous curiosity, as if he were truly seeing the extraordinary woman standing before him for the very first time. "I am Rachel Davis," she replied evenly, her voice steady, despite the hurricane of emotions tearing through her chest. "I am the outsourced cleaning lady." George stared at her unblinkingly and fired back, "No outsourced cleaner on the face of the earth speaks like that." Rachel finally lifted her chin, locking her brown eyes directly onto the intimidating gaze of one of Chicago's most ruthless billionaires. "You are absolutely correct, sir," she stated softly but firmly. "No cleaner should ever have to speak like this just to be taken seriously. But you demanded an answer, and I was not going to stand here and lie to you." Her heavy words hung suspended in the chilled air, carrying the unyielding weight of a final verdict. Hannah Miller abruptly broke the tension, her voice sharp and cutting like broken glass. "George, this is utterly absurd. We are not going to halt a massive acquisition based on the ramblings of someone who clearly has zero qualifications to even be on this floor. Our legal team reviewed this, and our auditors approved it." Oliver quickly chimed in, desperately trying to salvage his crumbling reputation. "Hannah is right. She probably just read a discarded memo and is repeating it without any proper context." George ignored them completely. His keen mind, the same mind that had built a financial empire from nothing, knew that the precision of Rachel's critique could not be faked. "How do you know about the confidential Serrano Bank clause?" he demanded quietly. Rachel clutched her thermos tighter against her chest, her heart hammering wildly. She knew she was walking directly into a dangerous trap. "I clean this boardroom late every single night, sir," she whispered truthfully. "The confidential documents are always left scattered across this table." Hannah immediately sprang from her seat, her voice rising in shrill panic. "You read highly classified corporate documents. George, this is a massive security breach. She needs to be fired this exact second and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Oliver enthusiastically agreed, sitting up straight. "Unauthorized access to confidential data. That is grounds for immediate termination and a massive lawsuit." Rachel felt the floor beneath her dissolve. This was her absolute worst nightmare, the exact terrifying scenario she had envisioned during those lonely, quiet nights, wiping down the mahogany table. But before George could summon security, Caleb Moore finally found his voice. "Wait just a minute," the young analyst interjected, causing every head to snap in his direction. Caleb swallowed hard, visibly trembling, but pressed on. "Before we call security or threaten lawsuits, could someone please verify if what she just warned us about is actually true?" George raised his hand, instantly silencing Hannah's furious protest. "Caleb makes a valid point," George murmured, making a decision that shocked the entire room to its core. George Foster slowly sat back down, steepling his fingers, and looked at Rachel with pure, unadulterated intrigue. "Sit down," he commanded, pointing to the empty leather chair at the far corner of the table. A chair that was always left empty, as if waiting for a guest who never arrived. Hannah gasped in outrage, and Oliver shook his head in frantic denial. But George kept his eyes locked on the cleaner. "I said sit down, Rachel," he repeated softly. "Explain every single detail to me. Walk me through the numbers, the hidden clauses, and all the fatal flaws you saw in those documents." Rachel hesitated, viewing the luxurious chair as a potential trap, another cruel method to elevate her, only to orchestrate a far more devastating fall. But as Rachel stood there, she thought of her fragile mother, Irene, and the endless years of crushing sacrifice. She remembered her locked-away dreams and the unfairness of a world that had forced her to trade her brilliant mind for a mop and a bucket. Rachel carefully placed the thermal pot on the side cabinet, walked purposefully toward the grand table, and took her seat. The simple sound of the heavy chair sliding across the carpet echoed like distant thunder. Hannah crossed her arms in silent, furious protest, while Benjamin Vance pulled out a notepad, preparing to witness history. Rachel took a slow breath, looked at the flawed charts, and began to dismantle the multi-million-dollar fraud with surgical precision. For the next 20 minutes, Rachel spoke not as a frightened janitor, but with the undeniable authority of a top-tier financial prodigy. She connected the hidden debts, exposed the inflated revenue projections, and mapped out the exact timeline of the impending corporate collapse. With every brilliant sentence, the executives' faces grew paler. When she finally finished, the room was enveloped in a suffocating shroud of profound shame. George Foster rubbed his tired face with both hands, the weight of his own hubris crashing down upon his shoulders. "If what you are saying is completely accurate, we were mere days away from losing absolutely everything," George whispered, the reality of the disaster chilling him to the bone. Penelope Ross spoke up again, her voice shaking but resolute. "I checked the live database while she was speaking, Mr. Foster. Every single metric Rachel quoted is perfectly accurate." George turned to Rachel, his eyes devoid of mockery, replaced now by a deep, unsettling fear of the abyss he had almost happily leaped into. He suspended the meeting immediately, silently waving his hand to dismiss the humiliated executives. As the room emptied, leaving only the executive and the cleaner, George asked her once more, pleading for the honest truth. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked gently. Rachel closed her eyes, preparing to reveal the painful history she had buried for years. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving the massive boardroom draped in an eerie, isolating quiet. George Foster gestured for Rachel to move closer, pointing to the luxurious chair right next to his own. "I want the absolute truth," he stated softly, his gaze stripped of all corporate pretense. Rachel nodded slowly, the protective walls around her heart finally beginning to crumble. I graduated at the very top of my class, from the Anderson Institute of Economics, she revealed, the words tasting like old, bittersweet ash. I specialized in advanced risk analysis and capital markets. For several years, I was a senior analyst at a prominent investment management firm here in Chicago, publishing papers and leading major portfolios. George did not move a single muscle, but his sharp eyes widened in genuine, profound shock. "Then why in the world are you emptying my trash cans?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the undeniable injustice. Rachel looked down at her rough, calloused hands. "My mother, Irene, fell terribly ill with a severe degenerative disease," she explained quietly. "The treatments were astronomically expensive. I tried everything, loans, extra shifts, selling all my possessions. But the medical bills devoured everything. The corporate world demands your entire soul, and when I needed flexibility to keep my mother alive, the system aggressively chewed me up and spat me out without a second thought." She explained how the aggressive corporate environment had zero tolerance for a woman struggling alone without a wealthy safety net. When her savings completely evaporated, she was forced to take the only job that offered the night shifts necessary to care for her dying mother during the day, an outsourced commercial cleaning position. George listened in absolute, stunned silence. He asked her how much the medical treatments cost, but Rachel politely refused his pity, stating she was not asking for a handout. "I am not offering pity," George replied, his voice thick with an unfamiliar, heavy guilt. "I am trying to understand how I allowed a brilliant mind to wash my floors, while paying absolute fools millions to ruin my company." Rachel looked at him with sad, tired eyes. "The worst part is not cleaning the floors, sir. I do that with honest dignity. The worst part is listening to your executives make catastrophic decisions every single night and being forced to remain silent because, to all of you, I am just an invisible apron." George stood up, walked to the grand window overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline, and stood there for a long time. When he finally turned back, he issued a command that would change both of their lives. He ordered her to return to this exact room tomorrow morning, not to clean, but to present her full financial analysis directly to the Supreme Board of Directors. Rachel left the towering glass building and took the long bus ride back to her small, cramped apartment. When she opened the creaking door, she found Irene wrapped in a faded blanket, sitting faithfully by an old radio. The emotional exhaustion of the day finally crashed over Rachel, and she fell to her knees beside her mother's chair, weeping silently into the woolen blanket. Irene gently stroked her daughter's hair, her trembling hands offering the purest form of unconditional love. Through her tears, Rachel recounted the entire unbelievable story, from the brutal humiliation to the miraculous invitation to address the highest corporate board. She confessed her deep terror that it was just another cruel, elaborate trap. Irene held Rachel's tear-stained face in her frail hands and looked deeply into her eyes with an unyielding, fierce strength. "I scrubbed floors and washed clothes my entire life so that you could use your brilliant mind," Irene told her firmly. "You are not going to let a group of men in expensive suits intimidate you. You go back there tomorrow, and you show them exactly who you are." Empowered by her mother's unwavering belief, Rachel spent the entire night sitting at her tiny kitchen table. Armed with only a cheap blue pen and a simple lined notebook, she meticulously documented every fraudulent number, every hidden clause, and every dangerous connection she had discovered in the Montgomery files. The next morning, Rachel walked into the Foster Capital lobby wearing her best, though slightly worn, professional outfit. The new security guard, Marcus, looked completely confused when she confidently stated she had a scheduled meeting on the executive floor, but a quick phone call confirmed her unprecedented clearance. As she stepped out of the elevator onto the plush carpet of the top floor, she immediately encountered a hostile blockade. Hannah Miller and Oliver Brooks were standing firmly in the hallway, holding a freshly printed legal document. Hannah smiled vindictively, informing Rachel that the legal department had officially classified her actions as a severe criminal breach of confidentiality. making any evidence she presented completely inadmissible. Oliver smugly tapped the tablet in his hand, warning her that if she dared to enter the boardroom, she would be facing total financial ruin and prison time. Rachel felt her heart pound, but the memory of her mother's brave face anchored her to the floor. "If my numbers are so entirely worthless," Rachel countered bravely, "you would not be standing in this hallway desperately trying to terrify me into leaving." Before Hannah could unleash another threat, George Foster appeared from his office. He calmly instructed them all to enter the boardroom, stating that the directors would ultimately decide whose truth carried the most weight. Rachel took a deep breath, clutched her notebook, and pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The grand boardroom was significantly more intimidating than the executive meeting room. 5 incredibly powerful directors sat around the massive oval table, their faces etched with decades of ruthless corporate governance. Rachel walked toward the available chair, her eyes scanning the imposing figures until her gaze locked onto the man seated at the absolute head of the table. Her breath hitched painfully in her throat, and her feet temporarily glued themselves to the carpet. Sitting there, reviewing a thick leather-bound dossier, was none other than Professor Samuel Norton, her beloved former mentor from the Anderson Institute. He was the man who had written her glowing recommendation letters before her sudden disappearance from the financial world. Samuel Norton slowly raised his head, his wise, aged eyes landing on Rachel. A complex storm of emotions washed over his deeply lined face. Pure shock, profound sorrow, and a heavy, unmistakable guilt. Before Rachel could even process the miraculous impossibility of his presence, Arthur Pierce, a stern, gray-haired board member, impatiently tapped his gold pen against the table and ordered her to sit down so they could commence the emergency proceedings. Hannah Miller immediately seized the opportunity, launching into a rehearsed, venomous speech, detailing Rachel's status as a lowly outsourced cleaner who had criminally stolen highly classified corporate data, demanding she be escorted out immediately. Rachel did not flinch under the hostile verbal assault. She calmly opened her inexpensive blue notebook and placed it gently on the polished mahogany table, right beside the glowing laptops and luxury leather portfolios. "I am fully aware that I broke protocol," Rachel addressed the board with unwavering clarity. "You can prosecute me tomorrow if you wish, but today, I implore you to look at the cross-penalty clause concerning the Montgomery Group." Arthur Pierce adjusted his reading glasses, his curiosity piqued by her absolute lack of fear. He leaned over, squinting at the meticulously handwritten pages, his stern expression slowly shifting into one of deep, unsettling alarm as he followed the undeniable logic mapped out in blue ink. "Are these figures perfectly accurate?" Arthur demanded, turning his fierce gaze toward Oliver Brooks. Oliver stammered, his face draining of all color, desperately searching for an excuse. Suddenly, the boardroom doors swung open, and Penelope Ross marched in, clutching her laptop. Trembling but displaying immense courage, Penelope loudly confirmed that she had spent the entire night running Rachel's specific parameters through the secure company database. Every single number, every hidden penalty, and every disastrous projection Rachel had written in her notebook was unequivocally true. Hannah glared at Penelope with absolute hatred, but the undeniable truth had already shattered their carefully constructed illusion. It was at this critical juncture that Samuel Norton finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice commanding absolute silence. "Before we discuss the financial technicalities," Samuel began, his tone heavy with regret, "I must properly introduce the woman sitting at the end of our table." The entire board turned their attention to the venerable professor. Samuel revealed that Rachel Davis was not merely a cleaning lady, but the most exceptionally brilliant mind he had ever taught in his entire academic career. He passionately described her flawless academic record, and confessed how deeply he blamed himself for losing track of her when she abruptly vanished from the professional financial sector years ago. Samuel stood up slowly, walked the entire length of the massive table, and stopped right in front of Rachel. In front of the most powerful executives in Chicago, the esteemed board member extended his trembling hand toward the woman in the faded blouse. "Please forgive me for not looking harder," Samuel whispered sincerely, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Rachel gently took his hand, the simple, profound gesture silently healing a wound she had carried for years. Samuel then turned back to the stunned directors, fiercely declaring that ignoring Rachel's analysis because of her temporary uniform would be the most catastrophic failure of corporate governance in the history of the firm. Given the floor and full authority, Rachel turned to the next page of her notebook, exposing a devastating secret she had uncovered. She expertly detailed how 3 seemingly independent vendor companies connected to the Montgomery acquisition were actually ghost entities. They all shared the exact same legal representative and funneled millions into a single offshore holding account. It was a brilliantly disguised embezzlement scheme, designed to siphon massive commissions directly from the acquisition funds. Diana Clark, another sharp-eyed board member, quickly cross-referenced the names and gasped aloud as she realized the massive scale of the impending fraud. The acquisition was not just a bad deal. It was a deliberate, malicious trap. George Foster stood up, the betrayal burning fiercely in his eyes, and stared directly at Oliver Brooks. "Who introduced the Montgomery Group to us, Oliver?" George asked, his voice lethally calm. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed confirmed everything. Oliver frantically tried to shift the blame to standard market channels, but his panicked demeanor betrayed his profound guilt. Rachel sat quietly, her handwritten notebook glowing like a beacon of absolute truth amidst a sea of corporate corruption. The brilliant mind they had treated like dirt had just saved their empire, and the true villains were now trapped in a cage of their own making. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted from tension to absolute outrage. Arthur Pierce formally motioned to instantly halt the Montgomery acquisition and immediately launch a full forensic audit into Oliver Brooks and his entire department. Recognizing his total defeat, Oliver hastily gathered his belongings and practically ran out of the room, his lucrative career completely destroyed. Following closely behind, Hannah Miller attempted to slip away unnoticed, but her cold, calculated composure was visibly cracking. The board members continued discussing the rapid deployment of legal teams, leaving George Foster standing by the window, silently grappling with the monumental disaster he had so narrowly avoided. As Rachel stepped out into the hallway to collect her thoughts, Caleb Moore hurried over to her side, his face pale with adrenaline. He whispered urgently that the previous evening he had accidentally seen a private message pop up on Hannah Miller's tablet. The sender was Richard Montgomery himself, confirming that Hannah was the secret architect behind the ghost companies and the fraudulent acquisition. Just moments later, Benjamin Vance approached them holding a confidential manila folder. Benjamin admitted he had been quietly investigating Hannah for weeks and had finally secured bank records proving she was receiving massive kickbacks from the very vendor companies Rachel had just exposed in the meeting. Back inside the boardroom, Samuel Norton asked Rachel to sit beside him for a private conversation. With a heavy heart, Samuel revealed a dark truth he had uncovered during his own investigations years ago. The investment firm that had originally fired Rachel did not let her go simply because of her required medical absences. They had aggressively pushed her out because she was getting dangerously close to uncovering an early iteration of this exact same fraudulent network. Her brilliant mind was deemed a massive threat by corrupt executives, meaning her years of poverty and suffering were not merely bad luck, but a deliberate corporate sabotage designed to keep her permanently silenced. Hearing this revelation, Rachel felt a profound mixture of grief and liberating vindication. Every closed door, every rejected application, and every humiliating night spent mopping floors was the result of cowardly men terrified of her unyielding integrity. George Foster approached the table, his posture humbled and deeply respectful. He formally offered Rachel a permanent, high-level executive position at Foster Capital, promising her the authority and respect she had always deserved. But before Rachel could even process the incredible offer, her cell phone vibrated violently in her pocket. It was an emergency call from Nurse Sarah at the Chicago Memorial Hospital. Irene's fragile heart had suddenly started to fail. Rachel ran out of the massive glass building, abandoning the billionaires and their corporate drama, and rushed to the crowded hospital. She burst into the sterile room to find Irene hooked to multiple flashing monitors, breathing shallowly but smiling bravely. Rachel fell to her knees, grasping her mother's weak hand, and sobbed, recounting the monumental victory in the boardroom. Irene squeezed her daughter's hand with unexpected fierce strength. In a whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 sacrifices, Irene told her brilliant daughter that she had not spent a lifetime washing dirty floors just to see her child refuse to fly. When the sky finally opened up for her, several grueling days passed, with Rachel refusing to leave her mother's bedside, entirely ignoring the frantic messages from the corporate world. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Samuel Norton softly walked into the hospital room carrying an official, heavy envelope. He informed Rachel that the board of directors had unanimously voted to create a brand new, extremely powerful position, Director of Integrity and Risk Analysis, and the chair belonged exclusively to her. Furthermore, Samuel revealed that Foster Capital was permanently covering every single penny of Irene's advanced medical treatments, not as an act of pity or charity, but as a mandatory, respectful debt owed to the woman who had saved their entire empire. Weeks later, Rachel Davis walked through the grand lobby of Foster Capital, leaving the cleaning cart behind forever. Marcus, the security guard, smiled brightly and greeted her with deep respect. She rode the elevator to the top floor and confidently pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the grand boardroom. The executive stood up in silent reverence as she walked toward the head of the table. She placed her cheap, blue handwritten notebook on the polished wood, taking her rightful seat. She had not changed who she was. Rather, the world had finally been forced to open its blind eyes and recognize the undeniable, brilliant fire she had carried all along. The trials we endure in the shadows are never meant to bury us. They are the heavy soil from which our deepest resilience grows. Society often mistakes a humble uniform for a small mind, rushing to judge the worth of a soul by the prestige of their title or the weight of their wallet. Yet, true dignity is forged not in comfortable boardrooms, but on calloused hands and tired knees, in the quiet, desperate hours of the night, when no one is watching. Hardship strips away our illusions, leaving only the purest core of our character, and it is in that absolute vulnerability that our greatest strength is born. When the world demands your silence, your integrity must become your loudest weapon. Never allow the arrogance of others to dictate your value or extinguish your internal light. The truth is an undeniable force, and it does not require wealth or privilege to shatter deception. In the end, the darkest struggles do not define our limitations. They simply prepare our wings for the magnificent height at which we were always destined to fly.